we can use Reut's counterfactual to ask about the Ottoman case, because your departure point in 1838, so a year later, is not only the Gulhan formatic, but it's also the Balkalimani agreement, arguably opening up the Ottoman Empire. So can we tie global intervention or imperial intervention into your discussion as well about what forms intervention in women's authority, sovereignty over their bodies, and at the same time, I wanted to point to the fact that the question of population and how you measure population, it depends on the unit, and what you presented. I mean, it's a transformation of these two kinds of units. So first would be the nation state that can enumerate the population, and later the standard modern, how would you say, nuclear family. And I wonder whether in a counterfactual, the repossession of women over labor would suggest also another model of family. Maybe this is something that Margaret Atwood with her model in Gilad Republic, right, which is not a nuclear family. This is something which is pointing towards. And Liat, I thought this was amazing. I mean, I had like itches as we were talking, and so but I wondered about going to the counterfactual. This is our main problem is not ants in the kitchen as much as there are the fact that without insects we don't have pollination, or the important role of insects in decay of matter and the creation of soil. So it goes much further into the whole, as well as our use of chemicals. I mean, the role of using chemicals in the flourishing of specific types of insects and not and decay of others. So I wonder how we can tie this to a broader question about the environment.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, I think yes, Baltalimana agreement is also symbolizes something, but for me, like the 19th century figures are kind of disturbing or confuses me all the time, because like throughout the century, the birth rates actually increased, not decreased. But like the Ottoman Empire underwent like major population loss because of other reasons actually. Like wars, especially the 1877-78 Russo-Ottoman War, and after that, like Balkan Wars, World War I, nation struggle were all important factors. Ottoman state lost a lot of territory, and then since they could not stop those macro factors, those broader factors, there's a huge discourse on women, saying that it is the main reason was the women who had abortions or who didn't give birth, which was obviously not correct. But I believe that the bureaucrats, statesmen, doctors knew about that. I mean, they were going through that, and it was impossible for them not to see that. But that is why I believe that there's an ideological choice there, where they shape their policies through women's bodies and sexuality. That's why I wanted to speculate from such a feminist point of view. But of course, yes, it was also a period where the Ottomans were kind of getting mad about not being a big power anymore, or to restore their power once again. So that population, a strong population, is maybe similar to Japanese case, is also related to progress, development, military, and that's kind of all on the background.
I wanted to interject before Liat gets a chance.
Follow up with that. think the story you're telling is much more important, because as Lutan said, the most important field where these poisons are used are in the fields. So it's agriculture. The story is food production, actually. And the same logic that you presented so interestingly of extermination is the story of modern agriculture. And this presents us with a much bigger question, because we may learn to live with lice and mice, but can we produce enough food without? And I was personally, I sprayed this shit over trees for quite a few years. Organic phosphorus, and the same, by the way, for weeds, what is called weeds. So these are highly poisonous materials that go into the food we eat. I use it in citrus orchards. So we try to control the level of, but these are very dodgy techniques. But the question is, of course, some of these materials are used to make our fruit just better looking, whereas others are designed to make more of it. So to imagine a world with some 8 billion people, to have enough food without these things is a much bigger task. That's one point. Second point that is related. At some point, 60s at least, maybe 70s, people are beginning to be aware, as you said, about the cost, environmental and health costs of these materials. And there is no question about, I mean, the epidemiologic works on disease related to these materials. So the countryside very often is more infected with disease than cities, at least these kind of disease related to these materials. But then campaigns, deception campaigns by these chemical producing companies begin. So Roundup is the best known example of weed extermination. So they're basically trying to claim for a long time now that it's not doing the damage it is claimed to do. So this only makes the questions harder to answer. To envision agriculture without this extermination logic is harder to do because of these campaigns that are ongoing, because there are huge lawsuits against Bayer who's producing Roundup. So I'm just saying, we can take it a step further, out of our kitchen, basically.
Wonderful questions. I don't have many answers to them. I think that what you're talking about reminds me of recent discussions about good germs and bad germs, and how antibiotics how our body is basically changing, because we're killing the good germs as well in our fight against disease. So what does it leave us? What kind of biology it leaves us with? And I think it's true about insects as well, and their impact on the environment. What you said about the control of level of toxicity, of course, the problem, and I'm talking now about the 50s and DDT, is that flies become tolerant to DDT quite early. So, what you start doing is, of course, decrease the level of toxicity, and which makes the entire thing much more toxic to everybody else as well. So that's it.
Michael Avner, can you pass the mic around?
Okay, I'd like to respond. Can't hear me, right? Go ahead, the press. It's like this. That's cute.
זהו? אוקיי. I wanted to respond in abbreviated fashion to each of the speakers in respective fashion. First off, Gulhan, you asked, what if women had more control over their reproductive choices? Personally, I'm not convinced that's a very helpful concept. This issue of female agency. And that's because such universalized models of rights are too easily assimilated into prevailing class structures, right? Which are devoted to restricting access, structures of power that are devoted to restricting access to wealth or the extraction of the wealth of some to others. And in that respect, some females become agents, often on the condition that others do not. I don't mean to raise here a general critique of second wave feminism, but what I'm pointing to is an issue that came up yesterday, and that is our observation that humanity as a category or as a concept is so abstract that it might not be particularly helpful for us because it's so impractical. That is, the universal resolution. It tends to obscure the actual workings of power and thus closes off political possibilities rather than the opposite. So for Liat, I was struck with a lot of things you said, but there was one remark towards the end of your talk about the need to change our sensibility regarding insects. And I was thinking that, in fact, the greater challenge and the more significant one would be to change our sensibilities regarding disease itself, which we associate with the insects. And that's largely because the liberal medicalization of the past 200 years or so, has largely succeeded in equating disease with moral failure, the moral failure of the individual, personal failure measured by getting sick, or measured in optimistically by our success in not becoming sick. Not, in fact, recovering from disease, but by not becoming sick in the first place, which is a form of risk avoidance that largely suits the liberal economy of the past 200 years as well. It's an escalating ethos, I think, the efforts we make in not becoming sick, which I would suggest over the past 50 years, a very close relationship with the environmental movement. These are, in fact, inform each other. So, Reut. Yesterday we talked about the military-industrial complex. Today you spoke to us about the military-medical complex. I wanted you to riff on that. I also wanted, along those terms, to ask more directly, you made it clear of the state's primary role and the role of imperialism as well. It wasn't entirely clear what the relationship is between the Japanese state and Japanese imperialism. I think it would have helped me, in fact. The Japanese state's busy with the Japanese population. Imperialism, almost by definition, is just as concerned with other populations, non-Japanese. It would have helped me had you devoted a few more remarks to the subject of non-Japanese bodies, or more specifically, non-Japanese diseases. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is where your statistics were from, that you so correctly expressed your skepticism about. In other words, who's generating the statistics? I have to assume they're actually state-generated. Now, statistics are arguably the most important form of modern knowledge, period, apropos of your interest in knowledge. There no doubt they became, in the 19th century, the last of the 19th century, a dominant form of medical knowledge, if not, in fact, the foundations of medical practice. So the connections I want to hear more about. And that should raise a very general issue for all of us, because the past day and a half, of course, we've noticed that the discourse of environmental catastrophe is profoundly numbers-driven. And I'm wondering if anyone has developed some kind of an epistemological critique or understanding of the use of numbers in the general conversation about catastrophe. and the way that these numbers might, in fact, as much interfere with our understanding as advance it.
Yeah, your question is, I think, a very big one, and I'm not sure whether I will be able to deal with it or convince you, or, I don't know, give a productive answer. But how should I put that? For example, yesterday, when we were talking about the terminology, for example, we discussed a little bit deficiencies of the term Anthropocene and how abstract it is, for example. And my point is here in a way that I argue that like humanity is also divided in the first place into genders, into men and women. Of course, we are now discussing that there are other genders, but like when we are talking about the anthropos as a broader category, we should be aware that again, there are differences, discrepancies in that. But when I am trying to mention or underline the feminine policy or female agency, yeah, this is I understand that it sounds a bit abstract still, and I have to work on it. But my point is trying to use feminine as a kind of an equivalent of the roads not taken, all voices that were silenced, or like all stories that had been made invisible or overlooked. So, of course, I'm aware of the shortcomings of such identity politics in a way, because other identities can claim also similar things, and that is a big part, I understand. But also the sex division or gender inequality is one of the most persistent inequalities in human history. So that is why I wanted us to think that way. But yes, I can see some of the shortcomings, but also that's a very big debate that we cannot be solved here, I think.
About the tolerance to disease, I think that's, again, an excellent point. I don't have anything to add here. I think what we can think of is what is the tolerable level of disease, because we, none of us wants to have typhus, but is the flu epidemic? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
Thank you. Okay, these are big questions, so I'll try to be brief and see what I can come up with. So in terms of becoming an empire and imperial expansion, you see that in the Meiji era it starts with sort of what historians called self-colonization, but quite early on you have an expansion to Hokkaido and Okinawa, 1869-79. And then with the Sino-Japanese War, Japan has its first colony, Taiwan, and after that you have more expansion into Korea, and eventually after the Russo-Japanese War into Manchuria. So this line is sort of slowly following behind, and it creates various interesting encounters. And there are different works about this that talk about how initially the first concern was about protecting the Japanese settlers in the different places, and then gradually developing public health systems within the different colonies, also in respect to the health of the local population. But at first it's more about the Japanese body in different places, and later about protecting for, well, you can argue about this, but mostly for utilitarian purposes, also the local populations. So statistics are very problematic. If I'm not mistaken, the practice is adopted mostly from Germany, like medicine in Japan. And then it's really interesting to see the statistics that I brought are mostly from military reports. So again, the Japanese military doctors write many, many reports after, and you have different numbers that boards of military doctors would compile based on reports written by unit military medical commanders in different places. And of course, it's problematic because you find various discrepancies between the numbers. Some say this, some say that. So you don't really know to what extent you could actually trust them. What's interesting to me is how they use the statistics, how they serve an important role in their international rhetoric. So, for example, the number of deaths in the Russo-Japanese War, that's something that is circulated abroad. The top Surgeon General of the military goes on a world tour and gives different speeches in different places, and it is then published in the Lancet, including the numbers, and it's celebrated in different places. And then within you have the use of statistics to drive reform and other factors, other places in the world, like the military in the US and Britain, they use these statistics to promote reform within their own lines. So the numbers do become very, very important. Again, I think in terms of scale, they give us a certain notion of what was happening. I wouldn't trust it in as an exact science, but again, as a measure of scale and as a rhetoric tool, I think they teach us quite a lot about the historical processes.
Miri, if someone can pass the mic. But Miri's next on my list.
Thank you. Three short questions or remark, one for each. Gulhan, could you say something about the current situation in Turkey? Because I imagine that the huge changes in the recent decades also include changes in attitudes and policies towards reproduction. And I also think about comparing and contrasting Turkey and Iran, where their policy became sometimes too effective that they had to change it and stop it, at least to several years. And Liat, you said that, I like the sentence, that we need to change our sensibilities towards sect. And you posed it as a question, and I wonder whether it is a question. Maybe it's already taken place. The whole scientific endeavor, which is now a very big thing, very fashionable, to talk about good germs. This couldn't have happened if the shift in thinking about germs as something positive have not already taken. And Reut, when you present us with Japanese military medicine as something new, I want to ask to what extent it's new, because I imagine, well, at least what I know from the Ottoman case, even before the new type of medical services, they had medical services, very different, much less effective, but so what is new in the new Japanese military medical services?
Like I briefly mentioned in the presentation from 1983, there were clearly antinatalist policies, and when I was being raised, we were always told that the population is too high, and if we have such a high population, like we won't be prosperous and we won't provide education for all, and so the population needs to, or growth rate needs to slow down. But all of a sudden in 2012, I think, President Erdogan told that Turkey is under the threat of the decline of its population, and then we should switch to pronatalism, and everybody should have at least 3 children, and sometimes he says 5 and sometimes 3. He's not so sure about that, but it is clear that we need to have more children. But the problem there is that, like, in terms of public education, like, it is hugely privatized, like health services are privatized in the same time as well, there's a huge shift to neoliberal policies. So when you don't provide any child care services, public education, public health services, and just ask women to have more children, those policies also in a way turn into misogynist policies, I would say, because women have to leave their paid work, they have to stay at home because there's no public support for that. And also the discourse is terrible in a sense as well. I'm not very sure about the figures. Some people say that there's a slight rise in the population increase rates, but still the 5-6 years is still too little to see the trend. But I think, for example, until 2013, abortion was provided freely at public hospitals. Now it is almost banned in public hospitals, and in private hospitals you have to get an approval of your husband if you are married, and if you are not married, it is another issue. It becomes even more difficult, but it was not so like that before 2013. So I think at least, I think also the population increase rates might be really increasing, but still it's kind of early to see the trend. And there were also huge demonstrations that I also participated some, and in the last years there's almost nothing about that. Anyway.
So, so whenever people fought in history, or whenever there were wars, there were always people who treated them. And also in Japan, in the pre-modern times, there was a form of wound medicine. There were groups that provided this type of treatment upon wounding during war. In Japan specifically, though, in the Tokugawa era, you had over 200 years of internal peace, so there was less use for them. You had groups developing treatment for trauma, but for accidents and things like that more. There were uprisings also, but it wasn't institutionalized. And what you see also in other places in the world is that towards the late 18th century and during the 19th century, there's this process of bringing medicine into the military. There were always different structures, but it became gradually a part, a part that couldn't be detached from the military. The military would have within it these services, so there would be institutions that the military built specifically to treat its soldiers. You have earlier examples, of course, from ancient Rome and Sung era China. There were some structures where you had within the military, but when you move further in time, the impression that I have, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that they're usually not a part of the structure. And this is new because it shows a different type of relationship between the military and military service and the person who serves. There's this assumption of a new kind of responsibility, not necessarily for humanistic reasons, but from various reasons, also due to the fact that militaries are much larger, and it's not only, the people who serve are not only serving from their own volition, so you have to sort of show your responsibility toward their welfare, and you have more public pressure coming through the mass media development and so on, that the people who serve will receive care from the institution that puts them in risk. So these are, you could argue that these are quite new in terms of that period in history. And in Japan it was new because, again, there was a long period of no activity in this sense, and also the people who built the system were, again, more sort of Euro-American oriented. Though, as I mentioned, in practice, lower-ranking doctors continued using practices that they knew from before. It takes a long time to train new kinds of military medical personnel. So that's a short answer to your question.
Just a quick answer to Miri. I think you completely agree. I completely agree with what you're saying. I just want to add that already in the 1940s, they know that they're killing good insects. But what they think is that it's worth it. The price is worth it because you're eliminating disease. It's only later that you start ask questions about the price.
So there are a few hands, the gentleman over here, and then Tamar will cluster them up in thirds, let's say. Try speaking loudly.
I would like to address the question that Liat rose. Can we stop and not kill? Can we stop and not kill all the insects? And I think it's a core issue in the environment crisis, and this is an issue of our culture, okay? The story that we tell ourselves that man is a part of nature, it's the role of man to dominate nature, to be in war with nature and conquer it. So all the time we hear that we conquer the desert and space and the deep seas and disease. And we try to eliminate all disease, not eradicate them, okay? And when we start to, when we succeed to eradicate a certain disease, we look at another disease that maybe 20 years ago we saw it as a mild disease, measles, now it's influenza, okay, you see it's now it's a very become very dangerous disease, and we must eradicate it.
If you can condense this to a question or a more
I think
because we have a long list of people who want to come
I think that's okay. Trying to answer that. The way we see ourselves, we can't stop because we can't make peace with. We are in war against nature, and so we can't make peace with insects, so we eradicate them.
Thank you. Tamar?
I have a question for Liat. I wonder if we can challenge the sort of dichotomy of us not getting along with insects, because I would argue that perhaps it's context specific. I mean, some of the anthropological work is a good way to look at this, including, for example, Hugh Ruppel's Encyclopedia, just one interesting book, but also historical examples. I'm now going, it's some name dropping, but ones that have been useful for me. So, for example, Cheka Nesta's Mavhunga is on verming beings that talks about colonial Zimbabwe and how people and insects become to be conceived animals in specific times and places, but not others. Or you can think about the role of cocoons or silkworm cocoons for the entirety of East Asian history and economy. So, but more to the point and to the time that you're talking about, just when you say we start fearing ants in our kitchen, or when DDT becomes a way to discard of insects, is also when at the time when insects or fruit flies and mice, and also lice to some extent, become sort of the center of how our knowledge is produced in the laboratory. So that's more or less when these specific animals enter the laboratory and become everything that we know about in biology. So it's really something here is not, they're not completely discarded of. It just depends where and for what purpose.
And a third question, Shira, did you raise this?
Just an ethical question about what comes out of all these lectures. Are you advocating in a way, I know you're historians, you're not advocating, but still, are you advocating local impacts? What does that mean for new measures for fighting global extinction? Is that bound to be also something that we can foresee? Because well, maybe that's it.
I have a question for Gulhan. As you probably know, Adrian Rich noted in 1976 that the then new notion of the non-medicalized birth and a birth led by midwives rather than male doctors and so forth had quickly become from a method of liberation for women into another method of oppression, because women were then faced by this binary opposition of either depositing themselves in the hands of the medical establishment and then giving up their sovereignty and autonomy, or alternatively give up modern medical knowledge altogether and give birth naturally in the woods, listening to shaman music. So how can we transcend this binary that is still prevails today? And the second question is that, to the best of my knowledge, obstetrics and gynecology, at least in Israel, I have no idea what it's like in other places, is today becoming very largely a feminized profession. The graduates of the residencies are mostly female. And as happened in every profession that has been feminized, like teaching and lawyers and whatever, as soon as this happens, wages drop and the status of the profession also drops. So how can we also overcome this obstacle?
Yes, the first question is really a very difficult one, and I'm confused about that actually, because I also have been participating in some workshops where, for example, once I listened a presentation about the doula violence. So I felt that it's maybe too much, and it's good to criticize, but then what are we going to do? And it's sometimes very hard to find correct answers. Yes, I'm also confused about that. I think I won't be. Again, personally, I think that everyone should have like secure conditions to give birth, where they don't feel themselves sometimes under violence. But I'm not sure how. But in Turkey, I'm surprised about what you said about in your second point. In Turkey, gynecology and obstetrics is still a male field. So yeah, they're earning a lot, and but it's really a male field. There are of course like female OB-GYNs, but not that much. So I don't know whether that will change in the short term, but it's not right now at least.
Tamara, I find your question very challenging. My story here was very Eurocentric, or largely Eurocentric, until I talked about how the role of vectors in transmitting disease was discovered, and there it was India and Tunis and so on. And I think this is a story that, a history that should be told, a global history of our relationship with insects, and there. It would be, we'll be talking about Europe, and then we'll talk about the colonies, and then we'll talk, I don't know, but I think you're right about times and places, and your idea about the laboratory blows my mind, so thank you. And I don't have an answer to Nama, sorry.
We have time for one last round of questions. If Omri, can someone pass the mic?
Okay, thank you very much. I have a short question to Liat about insects at houses, in urban houses. And I think that delinking the urban sphere from the countryside is actually a good move, because the challenges are different. But do you see any arguments or studies that about how more natural equals more growth? I mean, natural, I mean, with insects, because we are making progress. People say that they're making progress from pesticides to more flower-based materials to use it at home. So, is there any way to examine how living more with insects and or dealing them in another way is, I mean, makes more benefits to economically? This is just.
I don't know. I think the answer is the direction that Avner hinted at, which is agriculture, and I don't know.
I want to ask a question. I think I want to ask Naama's question, and maybe to kind of think specifically about this panel that is devoted to medical practitioners, and to ask what would happen, or do you think, or do each of you think that medical practitioners could be first converts in the cause of environmental action, and what would happen, and what would it look like if we started talking about environmental issues from the level of the human body and the levels of toxicity that it's exposed to, and the kinds of professional knowledge that OBGYNs are engaged with, and that warfare produces. And what would such an environmentalist endeavor look like if we started it in each of your cases from medicine? What would a curriculum, what would an academic curriculum look like in a medical school, in a school of medicine that you would want to inform? Something along these lines.
Okay, so I want to say a few things, and then, well, my colleagues are still struggling with the question. I'm going to struggle with it out loud. We're going to teach a class in the history of medicine in the Middle East in the Faculty of Medicine next year. So this is a question I started thinking about. And I think one of it, if we're teaching history of medicine in medical schools, one of the questions are, so why do we do today what we're doing? And part of it is born out of reasons that are no longer relevant. And I think that that doctors can rethink that. So that's one point of it. The other thing, I think the doctors are beginning to do some of it. So when my kids were babies, and we lived in a different country, they were given antibiotics. But when we lived here, antibiotics was only an option and only after testing, and so doctors are going towards less antibiotics, and I think they can be convinced with that direction as well. I also think that because the gynecological profession is feminizing, doctors are now asking their patients questions that male doctors never asked me. So these are things that are moving toward the right directions, and I think they can go further there because, and it just talking with doctors, having this conversation with them actually is in one step in this direction. Yeah.
Yes, that will be kind of a speculation, but my observation of what I see when I look around, at least in Turkey, is that doctors seem to be kind of denialists in a way in terms of global warming or environmental crisis awaiting us. For example, in the case of births, still it's one of the most medicalized fields. They use a lot of medicine, like in Turkey, C-section is the most common childbirth method. So, and they believe in antibiotics, and there are of course people just criticizing that. But when I see that picture, I see them in a way a bit denialist and don't see so much agency there.
Yeah, That's a complicated question. I think two things that came to mind immediately when I think about the present is in cancer research, there is a move trying to develop more specified and gene-based treatments to take us away from chemotherapy, and you have certain pushbacks against the chemicalization of medicine, but I'm not sure that in these cases you have doctor's agency, but at the same time it will require the redefinition of the relationship between industry and the medical profession, pharmaceutics, and economy, the economic model more widely. So you have advocacy for that, and who knows, I hope that these relationships would be rethought, but yeah, we'll have to see.
Thank you very much. So please join me in thanking our panelists.